From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
We start with breaking news. Chris Christie set to withdraw from the 2024 presidential race just days before the Iowa caucuses.
Plus, spot Bitcoin ETFs are officially approved by the SEC in a milestone for digital assets. We'll have more with SEC Commissioner Hester Pierce.
This hour, we'll speak as well with Congressman Bill Huizenga from Michigan, the Republican. We'll have more insights, and we'll bring you in-depth analysis and coverage from our Bloomberg reporters and analysts on what has turned into another very busy breaking news day, Kaylee.
Indeed.
We're going to get to the Bitcoin ETF. It's real this time.
It is.
But remarkable news coming from New Hampshire, not the one we expected to see today, after Chris Christie said just last evening that he was rejecting calls to drop out of the race.
Yeah, the former governor of New Jersey, who, of course, is polling behind other candidates like Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis, and, of course, the frontrunner Donald Trump, now leaving the 2024 race. And we are expecting that he will be speaking, Joe, really any minute now. And, of course, our wonderful Nancy Cook here at Bloomberg scooped this news. So let's go now to Nancy Cook alongside our Akela Gardner and Jonathan Tamari of Bloomberg Government. So, Nancy, tell us more about what we know. How did he come to this decision when so recently we thought he was in it for a while still, at least?
Well, Christie really, he has been polling, far behind. He is not playing in Iowa at all. I think the donor money was starting to dry up. And he has been against former President Trump being the Republican nominee for months now. He has been Trump's fiercest critic among the Republican field. And so there was a ton of pressure on him to drop out, basically to ensure that what happened in 2016 didn't happen again, which was that the field was so fractured among Republican candidates that Trump took the nomination. People pressured him and said, you need to drop out so that hopefully Nikki Haley or someone else will actually have the chance to emerge. And we're expecting him to make that announcement that he's leaving the race at 5 today at an event that he had already scheduled in New Hampshire.
Yeah, we're seeing live pictures of that event as we wait for things to get going. Jonathan Tamari, you've been covering Chris Christie since 2008 through the bulk of his political career. And I wonder if you could bring us inside his head today. As we just said, he's mentioned just last evening that he would not drop out of the race until the New Hampshire primary. What do you think changed his mind, and what will he do now?
Well, I think there's probably a realization that he's not going to be the nominee, and that the only person, his main goal was to stop President Trump, and the person who appears to have the best chance of doing that is Nikki Haley, and the best place for her to do that is New Hampshire. And so I think there's probably a realization that he has his most support in New Hampshire, that if she's going to have any chance, Trump is probably going to win Iowa pretty big if the polls are accurate, that she needs to do really well in New Hampshire, and he's probably pulling votes away from her. They probably have a pretty similar base of voters, and that stepping aside now gives other Republicans the best chance to block Trump from becoming the nominee again.
Well, Nancy, I'm glad that Jonathan there brought up New Hampshire, this idea that Chris Christie voters who have said they would support him in New Hampshire would then go to Nikki Haley if he's out of the race. If we're playing the numbers game, could that mean we actually see an upset in New Hampshire, assuming she does well enough in Iowa that Nikki Haley could actually potentially win the first in the nation primary?
Potentially. There was a new polling out this week from CNN that showed that she was definitely gaining ground on Trump, and that the margin between them was much closer than it had previously been. And so I do think if Nikki Haley comes in second in Iowa, she enters New Hampshire with some momentum, we could see, and she's able to pick up the Christie supporters, which includes some independents and some Democrats who changed party affiliation to vote in the New Hampshire primary. New Hampshire could actually be a real race.
Amazing. And then it becomes a story of momentum, as we will hear later this hour from our own Republican analyst, Rick Davis, who's been there. A win like this, as you point out, an upset, Kaylee, could change the numbers in every other state overnight. And, Akela, that's why I wonder what the view is from the Biden camp. It's great to have you back, by the way. The conventional wisdom is that the Biden campaign is much more worried about facing a Nikki Haley than a Donald Trump, and that just became somewhat more possible, didn't it?
I think you're absolutely right. I think in the immediate terms, does Chris Christie dropping out have any immediate impact on Biden? I think no. But I do think that he's losing somewhat of a voice or almost a surrogate of someone who is anti-Trump. It's hard to downplay how few Republicans are as outspoken as Chris Christie. And he has quite a bit of credibility. Of course, he endorsed Donald Trump in 2016. He was considered for the chief of staff job. And he's really been on the airwaves, really talking about the things that Biden is centering in his campaign, talking about democracy, talking about the soul of the nation. And I think somewhat he has praised Biden in some ways. He's praised him on the foreign stage for his visits to Israel. So I think this is just one less person that he can sort of point to, like a Liz Cheney, who they can say, not everyone in Donald Trump's party is supporting him.
It's interesting to hear you describe Chris Christie as almost a surrogate, because in many ways, what we have heard from the former governor of New Jersey is the very same things we're hearing from Biden about him being a threat to democracy and someone who is unfit to serve as president. It just raises the question, Akela, if now Biden is having to consider not just the potential of a Donald Trump Republican nominee, but potentially also a Nikki Haley one, would he have to change that messaging? Maybe it's harder to run on when it's not just Donald Trump that's the alternative.
He would absolutely have to pivot. That means he would have to defend his record on the economy. He would start having to talk about his age. That is a lot harder to do than to simply say, I am not the other guy. And I think if Nikki Haley were by some possibility the nominee, then that strategy has to change completely.
Jonathan, I'm trying to rationalize, again, what we heard from Chris Christie last evening. He was at a barbecue restaurant in New Hampshire. He said, don't expect South Carolina to save us. This idea that Nikki Haley could come flying out of New Hampshire and close the deal in her home state. And he added that if Donald Trump wins New Hampshire, he will be the nominee. Is he right?
Very likely, yes. I mean, if he wins Iowa and then New Hampshire, it's hard to see how you stop that momentum that former President Trump would have at that point. He's already leading widely in the national polls. New Hampshire is a state that might be more friendly to a different style of Republican. It's a state that is a little more affluent, a little more college educated, which is a group Trump has struggled with. So if anybody is going to stop him, that is among the early states. That's probably one of the better options for any Republican who's trying to stop him from being the nominee.
Well, it's so interesting that this news is coming on today of all days, because not only are we 5 days out from the Iowa caucuses, but we are just hours away, Nancy, from Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley sharing the debate stage and Donald Trump simultaneously appearing in a separate town hall on Fox while they're on CNN. How does this news change the dynamics, potentially the tenor of what we hear from the candidates who are still in the race tonight?
Well, I think that it means we've already seen Donald Trump really starting to go after Nikki Haley the same way he was going after DeSantis for the past 6 months. He has really turned his attention towards her. And I expect tonight that he will really, really go after her. Much more so. I'm sure DeSantis and Haley will be asked about Christie dropping out in that debate. But what I will be watching for is the type of language and the type of attacks Trump uses against Nikki Haley. They have really been trying to paint her as an establishment candidate, sort of in the vein of like a Jeb Bush, and criticizing her ties to China, things like that. So I'll be curious to see how those attacks ramp up.
It's noteworthy that Trump is going on Fox Live for the first time in almost 2 years, and on any cable network since that CNN town hall that got the head of the network fired. What are we in for tonight, Donald Trump?
Well, I think that what his campaign and what he wants to do is really make sure that they have very large wins in Iowa and big wins in New Hampshire. They want to have the nomination completely locked up by mid-March. And before this, they thought that they would. You have to remember that he is facing so many legal challenges, and those really start to kick up in terms of the courtroom appearances in mid-March. And so they want to have it sewn up by then.
Great conversation with a lot of news flying today. Our big thanks to Nancy Cook, Akela Gardner, and Jonathan Samari for great insights today. Coming up, we'll have more on the other breaking story we're following today, the SEC decision to approve Bitcoin ETFs, nearly a dozen of them. That's still ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Much awaited decision for the crypto community as the SEC at last approves exchange-traded funds that invest directly in Bitcoin. Just one day after that false post on the SEC's X account on Twitter claimed that the agency had already made that approval. This time, it's real. Joining us to discuss, Bloomberg's Eric Balchunas and Sonali Basak. We're going to the experts today with Kaylee Lines at my side. It's great to see you both. And we finally got here after a bit of wrangling yesterday. Sonali, put this in perspective for us, the significance of this development for the crypto community and whether it might lead to other ETFs backed by other crypto.
Well, let's see how the next couple of days go. It certainly is a momentous moment for the crypto community. They've been waiting for it for a decade. Now, when people used to hold Bitcoin, they either did it personally through cold or hot storage or through a futures contract where they were a little more removed from the actual product. And now they can rely on an issuer, the likes of a BlackRock or a Grayscale, to different ends of the spectrum, an ARK, to help them get an access, financial exposure to an asset that is really gaining a little more mainstream adoption than it had a lot more than it had a decade ago. So certainly a moment. We should also say, though, the caution that is embedded in this moment as well. Until these things start trading, we don't know how the story goes. You are starting to see Bitcoin just rise a little bit higher. It's standing at this moment above 46,000. But again, the run-up has been significant in the last several weeks with the announcement of these crypto assets. Should they not get the kind of demand that was initially expected, you can see some significant fall off in the crypto prices and therefore a muted response to these ETFs as well as a drop off in Bitcoin. Could go either way.
Okay, so Eric, come in on that note, because obviously we were talking about almost a dozen products that simultaneously are going to be able to hit the ground here. I guess the question is, can they all hit the ground running, or does someone have to be out front in that race? How are you expecting this to go, knowing the great variety in fees we have seen from these issuers?
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating. I've been covering ETFs for almost 20 years, and they've never, ever allowed 11 ETFs, even two, to launch at the same time. So as we talk about on ETF IQ, we're calling it the Cointucky Derby because it really does feel like a giant horse race, and it's going to be a great experiment. The fees are all now kind of rallying around where BlackRock went. And that makes sense because if you're much higher than BlackRock at 25 basis points now, most advisors are going to be like, well, to the sales rep, I like you, we're friends, but I'm just not paying double what I can get at BlackRock. So BlackRock threw down a gauntlet at 25 basis points. I didn't think we'd get to 25, 20 until like 2 years from now. So the fee war happened already before the starting gate even happened. That's a good sign. Advisors love cheap ETFs. So if we are going to see that adoption that Sonali's talking about, it's probably going to be from the advisor market. I think retail probably a little cooled since the 2021 mania, but advisors are the target market. They have 30 trillion, but they're going to wait a little longer to bite. I think they're going to look to see which is the most liquid one. They'll probably talk to their clients a little bit. So medium, long term, we see some success in this category. Short term, a little more anybody's guess.
Sonali, you referred to the muted reaction that we're seeing here in prices. What do you make of that? Is this baked in the cake, or could there be another leg higher when these ETFs start buying?
When I say it could go either way, it's interesting. One person I had been kind of in communication with is Mike Novogratz, a billionaire investor who has long invested in crypto and has made a lot of his recent money from the crypto industry. He said tomorrow could be chaos. It's anybody's guess, really, how things could go. He thinks Bitcoin goes higher in a year, and he's previously told me that it could retest the highs of 2021, even this year. And he's not the only one that feels this way. There's something interesting going on. This is kind of technical, guys, so bear with me. But there's this thing in a couple weeks or several weeks here called the halving. And essentially what happens within Bitcoin's programming is that the supply shrinks. So people who believe in the idea of Bitcoin believe that the demand for Bitcoin is increasing via these ETFs at a time when the supply is decreasing. So that has never happened in the moment, and at least not in this way, in the history of Bitcoin, which of course is a fairly nascent asset class here. But you do have dynamics around the Bitcoin industry that are changing at the same time, which means that you're not really going to see the full impact of all these changes around the crypto community, the Bitcoin network in particular, for a while here.
Well, and of course, we're talking specifically about Bitcoin here, and potentially, Eric, if you look at the statement that the chair, Gary Gensler, released, it would suggest that he is being very specific. These are just spot Bitcoin products. This does not indicate anything about future products. But knowing that there are Ether futures products out there and that the SEC has been very reluctant to designate Ether as a commodity like Bitcoin or as a security, what about a spot Ether product in the future?
Yeah, so, James and I are into odds, right? People like that. We were early being optimistic on this approval. We had 90% before it was cool. Turned out to be right. We're currently in about the 70% area. We've been so focused on this, we haven't looked forward to Ether, but based on, again, BlackRock filed. So BlackRock sees something. And think about this math. If they approved Bitcoin futures a while ago, Grayscale sued them because how could you approve futures and not spot? And they said, okay, we approve spot. Then they approve Ether futures. Ipso facto, they almost are painted into a corner to have to approve at least Ether. Now, beyond that, I don't know. I'm going to say that would be more medium long term. But Ether futures, that deadline is going to be in May. And I would be, if I had to bet, I would say they do approve them. But I'm nowhere near 95, which is where we were this week on this approval. So we'll be watching it. But again, we've been so occupied with this, we haven't done the nitty gritty work on the Ether side yet.
Fair enough.
To your point, though, Kaylee, it would have to start with a definition. You've spent so much time on this, covering that in Washington. I don't know if you can get an answer out of Gary Gensler on that, but how would that process work for Ether?
Well, this is a question that he's been very reluctant to directly answer on. The SEC has said that Bitcoin is a commodity that maintains basically all other digital assets or tokens are securities, and that therefore they are subject to the securities law that is already on the books. What it would take to change that is an act of Congress, realistically, to delineate what the CFTC versus the SEC has jurisdiction over and essentially have actual lawmaking happen, which to this point we haven't seen, which is why we see these things taken to the courts, primarily, and enforcement actions being the name of the game here. Sonali, just a final note to you. If you look at Gensler's statement, he says we did not approve or endorse Bitcoin. So broadly tone-wise, when we think about the regulatory focus on crypto, that's not necessarily going away in terms of the threat of enforcement and more hostility potentially.
And the other thing he says is that the commission's action today is regarding one security here, one non-security commodity, rather, he says. And that is non-security commodity is important wording, Bitcoin. And so remember, as he's looking at a lot of these exchanges here and what defines a security and not, that is still a massive question. He is still fighting exchanges outside of this. And we are very much questioning what it means to be a crypto exchange in the age of an ETF.
All right, Bloomberg's Sonali Basak and Eric Balchunas of Bloomberg Intelligence, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and great work on this throughout this entire saga. Coming up, we're going to get more clarity on what exactly regulators are thinking. SEC Commissioner Hester Pierce will join us on this historic spot Bitcoin ETF decision coming up in just a few moments. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. U.S. regulators approving spot exchange-traded funds that direct investly in Bitcoin for the first time, authorizing 11 such products to begin trading on Thursday. SEC Commissioner Hester Pierce writing in a statement after this decision, quote, I am celebrating the right of American investors to express their thoughts on Bitcoin by buying and selling spot Bitcoin ETPs, and I am celebrating the perseverance of market participants in trying to bring to market a product they think investors want. I commend applicants' decade-long persistence in the face of the Commission's obstruction because, yes, this has been a long time coming. We are talking about a 10-year process that ultimately came to an end today with the approval of these 11 products. Joining us now on both Bloomberg Television and radio is SEC Commissioner Hester Pierce. Commissioner Pierce, how are you feeling this evening?
Well, Kaylee, I'm delighted that we're at the end of this saga. I know there's still pieces of it to go, but I think this is a big milestone.
Well, it's a milestone certainly for these Bitcoin products, but it also raises a question of what sort of precedent this sets. If you look at the statement from the chairman, Gary Gensler, he was very specific that this is specific to these Bitcoin products, which are non-security commodities. And there is a question of what this could mean in the future for essentially everything else. Is that door completely closed?
The chair is right to point out that this is specific to a particular set of products. But obviously precedent matters. And so you look at the reasoning, and people will do this. They'll look at the reasoning in the order, and they'll seek to apply it to other facts and circumstances as appropriate. So I think the only thing I will say is that one of my complaints in this area has been that we haven't always stuck with precedent when it comes to these kinds of exchange traded products. We haven't necessarily applied the same standards that we do with respect to other kinds of exchange traded products, but it is a precedent people will point to.
That's the question, of course, we're all asking, whether it opens the door for other ETFs backed by other cryptocurrencies. Commissioner, is that in our near future?
Again, every application has to be considered on its facts and circumstances. But one of the things that I think that we have to acknowledge is that when we apply a particular rationale to one particular product, people will ask us to apply it to other products as well.
Well, and there also is the question, Commissioner, of just the use of these products once they do begin trading as expected tomorrow. What kind of fiduciary responsibilities are there for investment advisors for their clients before allowing them to put money into these products?
It's like anything else. A fiduciary is supposed to look out for the interests of the investors that she's working with. And that means taking into account the specific circumstances of that investor, the risk tolerance, the other elements of that investor's portfolio. And so it's not a cookie cutter answer one way or the other. Fiduciaries are paid to make good decisions that are appropriate for that particular investor.
There were a few moments yesterday when we thought this had been approved a day earlier, Commissioner. As you well know, everything worked out with the Twitter account at the SEC?
Well, it is. I mean, there was a statement, I think, that came out saying that we are going to be looking into this and working with law enforcement authorities to figure out how this happened, how yesterday's event happened, and I hope that we get to the bottom of it, and I hope that we're as transparent when we explain what happened as we expect the companies that we regulate to be when they experience a similar event.
Well, that certainly has gotten the attention of many on Capitol Hill, Commissioner. There have been many congressional Republicans who have made their opinions known about the SEC under this chair for some time now, who have called a lot of attention to yesterday's events. I'd also point to a statement that we got out from that House Financial Services Committee after this. They maintain that while legislation to provide clarity and certainty for digital assets remain necessary, the steps taken today are a significant improvement over what they call the SEC's track record of regulation by enforcement. Until that legislation exists, even with these approvals aside, should we expect that regulation by enforcement to continue?
Well, I haven't seen much progress on us as a regulator setting out clear rules of the road when it comes to crypto products and services. And I think that that's been a complaint that I've had. It's been a complaint that others have had. We could, just as we changed our tune here, we could change our tune on that. And so I remain hopeful that we will. That said, Congress has expressed an interest in legislating in this area, and I look forward to seeing their work in this area. And they have a clear interest in figuring out which regulators should have authority in this area. And I look forward to seeing what comes of that.
As do we, Commissioner, as do we. Obviously, while we're waiting for that, a lot will just depend on the actions of the Securities and Exchange Commission. And in addition to a lot of these enforcement actions, if you will, there are also just questions around fraud and manipulation. The argument initially about what Chair Gensler was so concerned with about these products in the first place, spot products specifically, compared to futures. Obviously, a court has ruled that distinction was arbitrary and capricious. But do you share any concern now that these products are approved? The deed is done. These things are going to trading, especially in light of the instance we saw yesterday in which prices moved on false information. Do you think that more investors, institutional or otherwise, now could fall into something potentially here that could be damaging, given how volatile this market has proven to be and how potentially easily it can move?
if people put out false information about a traditional security, a traditional company, the stock of that company the price can also move. So this is not unique to Bitcoin or Bitcoin exchange traded products. Obviously, we will continue to look at the markets and at the markets for these Bitcoin exchange traded products specifically. And if there is bad activity, it's within the ETP marketplace, we have authority there to investigate and bring enforcement actions as needed.
Our thanks to SEC Commissioner Hester Pierce. Thank you for the insights today on Bloomberg. And another important breaking story, another big one that's hitting this hour. If you were with us earlier, we told you former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie is pulling out of the race, pulling out of the GOP race for the nomination before he ever gets to New Hampshire. He's in fact speaking right now, as you can see, to supporters in New Hampshire, the state where he had thrown all of his chips down. And we go now to Republican Congressman Bill Huizenga of Michigan with a few things that we'd like to talk about. Congressman, welcome back to Bloomberg. It's good to see you. I wonder your thoughts here on what's happening inside the Republican race for president and whether this will move the needle on who might be able to win early states. And by that, we mean Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis.
Yeah, I don't see either one of them, and I didn't see Chris Christie crossing that threshold either. I mean, everywhere you look, whether it's in Michigan or a number of other states, Donald Trump has a commanding lead. I don't see that diminishing. I truly believe he is going to be the nominee for the Republicans. And I think the same thing is happening over on the Democrat side. Just ask my former, colleague Dean Phillips how it's going, right? I mean, it's going to be a Joe Biden versus Donald Trump race again.
Well, and it's not just the question of the influence Donald Trump may have if he once again gets to sit in the Oval Office, but also an active question of even just as a former president and a candidate, perhaps a leader of the Republican Party, he already has his degree of influence in the chamber in which you now are, Congressman. How heavily does he weigh on the decisions of, say, the Speaker of the House?
Well, certainly he has influence in that, much like a lot of our other thought leaders. But I don't believe it's monolithic. It never has been. Certainly when you're sitting in the Oval Office and you can decide whether you're going to sign a bill or not, that gives you a lot more sway. There is absolutely no doubt. And I think it depends on the district and the state as to whether how far he can move the needle. I think he moves the needle pretty much anywhere in the Republican primaries, for example. But, how far and how deep he can move that needle is really variations depending on the state and the district and the makeup of the district.
Well, we find ourselves in an interesting moment again here, Congressman. We seem to do this when we meet up with you on the air. Speaker Mike Johnson spoke today with both of the individuals that we're talking about, Joe Biden and Donald Trump. We're 10 days away from a possible government shutdown. What are you hearing, whether it's on your Financial Services Committee or elsewhere in the House? Are we shutting down?
I hope not. We shouldn't. It's avoidable. It never works out well for the Republicans on this because, frankly, we just don't have the American people with us on this. And look, I agree with whether it's Grover Norquist, Stephen Moore, others on the right, those thought leaders on the right who acknowledge that Speaker Johnson, has a bad hand in front of him. And he's doing the best that he possibly can with it. Now, what we saw earlier today is 12 of my colleagues decided to abandon that and vote against our rule. And what that means is no bills are going to be able to come to the House floor. And to me, that's a tactical mistake. I don't believe it's going to have the right outcome of where we need to be going, which is getting our priorities, our budget priorities, put in place rather than having a continuing resolution and rather than having shutdown.
Well, that's the tough part, I guess, right? Republican leaders in the Senate say you will need a continuing resolution. I know the Speaker was asked about that several times today. He pledged in November to not entertain such a concept. Would he get fired like Kevin McCarthy if he went in that direction?
I really hope that we've learned a lesson from the experience of vacating the chair. That was a horrible mistake, in my opinion. Never should have happened. It did, brought 3 weeks of chaos on top of chaos. and that's not a wise direction to go. I will say this: there is a significant difference, though, having a CR that is a much shorter term as details are getting worked out versus something that's longer term. And what we know is that is a significant impact on things like the Defense Department. But I'll tell you, a number of my colleagues and I have been talking about this. If there's any kind of CR, any kind of other bridge funding scheme that's going to be coming up, we want some things in there, one of those being a debt commission. That's something that I've been working on for a number of years. And we've got to get, at the end of the day, we've got to get at what are the real drivers of our debt and our deficits that we're seeing here in Washington, D.C. And I think the American people get it in their gut. They understand we are wildly out of whack. We've been spending way more than what we should be, and it's time to rein all of that back in. And that includes, the entitlement programs, which account for over 70% of our spending, which is on autopilot at this point. My colleagues never even have a say in how that is being spent. It just automatically happens. That doesn't make any sense.
Congressman, I'd like to ask you about some other news we've received really just in the last hour or so. The approval of 11 spot Bitcoin ETF products here in the U.S. by the SEC. Arguably, it is a huge milestone for the digital asset industry, a step forward, if you will. And yet, if you look at the language in the statement from SEC Chair Gary Gensler, he is firm to point out this only applies to non-security commodity Bitcoin products, and goes on to say this approval does not signal anything about the Commission's views as to the status of other crypto assets under federal securities law. Is this a real step forward, or is it they had to do this, but it's status quo on regulating this industry?
Well, first we ought to make sure it wasn't out of a hacked account. I'm half joking about this.
This is real. I'm reading to you from the SEC.gov site, Congressman.
Yeah, I know. But, look, you just had Hester Pierce on, and she's a brilliant mind on this and a great voice in this. At the end of the day, this process did not need to play out the way that it has played out. It just simply didn't. And it was March of last year where Gary Gensler denied, I think it was an application for spot Bitcoin. And at the end of the day, Congress does have an appetite to be engaged in this. We have the ability to get engaged with this, and it really should be with our involvement. So this is important. I'm glad to see these ETFs were approved. Gary Gensler has a track record, though, of extending and pushing the envelope and, frankly, overreaching not just the traditional, but I would argue legal bounds. Look at all the number of court cases that have come back to him, just even most recently on the stock buyback rule that he had in December. Fifth Circuit has been very, very busy correcting the SEC and correcting more specifically Gary Gensler on this. So I think this is an important step. I think it's the right direction, and we'll see where this is going to lead to. But for a guy who is by his own admission, a Bitcoin and crypto expert, he certainly hasn't demonstrated that to a lot of us in the way he's been handling it. And as Trade Commissioner, he viewed everything as a commodity, right? And now suddenly, as SEC chair, everything is a security. And kind of which is it? And the issue is that it's kind of both.
Well, and Congressman, of course, that is very much what your House Financial Services Committee has tried to address through market structure legislation that would delineate the role of the CFTC versus the SEC. That really an effort being led by the current chair, Patrick McHenry. But, sir, Patrick McHenry is retiring. Is that a bucket of water you'd like to carry forward if the House is kept by the Republicans come 2025?
Well, you have a very important caveat right there, and that's got to be our first goal and first aim that we have, which is maintain the majority, because we have to do that. Yes, I'm very interested. This is my third subcommittee that I've been leading on it, on the committee. I've got a broad breadth of it, but we've got a really good team, and I know Patrick's going to continue to run through the tape through the rest of this congressional year, and we've got a lot of work ahead of us, but we're up to the task, and I look forward to working with all my colleagues on it.
All right, Congressman Bill Huizenga from Michigan, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We appreciate your time. Coming up, former Governor Chris Christie set to end his 2024 campaign. We are looking at live pictures of him speaking now on the matter. We'll have more details next with Rick Davis, partner at Stonecourt Capital. He's run many campaigns himself. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. It's happening right now. Chris Christie talking to supporters in New Hampshire after dropping out of the race for president. He just made that official a moment ago. And joining us now for insights, Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributor, partner at Stonecourt Capital, who has run several campaigns in the state of New Hampshire and has been at our side here for the balance of this campaign. Rick, I thought we'd be talking about Chris Christie when we got to New Hampshire. In 2 weeks, he said just last evening that he was rejecting calls to drop out of the race, that there was no magic in South Carolina that would save us from Donald Trump. Did somebody get to him? Was it a phone call? How do you explain it?
Typically, I don't think there's any inside information on what triggered his decision, and I'm highly confident that it wasn't triggered in the last 12 hours, right, since his statements last night. So I think this is something that he's been looking at and concerned about, because as he said in his comments tonight, he did not want to be somebody who enabled a Donald Trump presidency. And if his continuing to be in this race did that, then that undermines exactly one of the reasons why he got into this race to begin with. So he's being very practical. This is a raw political decision he's made. I'm pretty sure last night's comments were based on the fact that he had this surprise announcement today that he wanted to still be a surprise. Funny, campaigns always love to have surprises, and none of them are ever surprising to anybody. And so the bottom line tonight is this is a big deal. Going into Iowa, it steals some of the thunder, but it's really targeted toward the New Hampshire campaign, where he had enough votes in some of the polls to even be ahead of Ron DeSantis. So the reality is that this will probably enable Nikki Haley to continue her momentum in that Granite State, New Hampshire, and could make it a real race for Donald Trump.
But Rick, Chris Christie himself doesn't seem to think so. If you take what he said on a hot mic moments before coming out onto the stage at face value, he was caught saying she's going to get smoked. That's a quote in the primary race. Another quote, she's not up to this. But does his departure make it more likely that she is?
Yeah. Who knows what his thinking is as far as her prospects. But his departure does make it more likely that she's competitive. The bottom line is in the polls we've seen publicly and the ones that I've seen privately, he's anywhere from 5 to 15. And his vote is almost universally never Trumpers, right? They're not going to DeSantis. They're not going to Trump. They're not going to Vivek. I mean, they are people who only want to oppose Trump. And that's the lane he's in, and that's the lane he stayed in. The reality is the only one in the polling data that they find acceptable is Nikki Haley. And the one thing Nikki Haley has to do is avoid being pegged as a never Trumper, because the other votes that she has are people who are not willing to say they hate Trump, but they would prefer an alternative, and she's a better alternative to them than Donald Trump.
Well, we've got a debate tonight, Rick Davis. Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis on the same stage. Donald Trump is counter-programming with his triumphant return to Fox. What can Nikki Haley do to seize on the moment here, or will Republicans even see this while Donald Trump is doing his thing?
Yeah, this is kind of a three-ring circus day, isn't it? I mean, we've got, Trump on Fox and the two contenders on CNN and Chris Christie showing up to steal the show. And even Donald Trump got in the act by criticizing Fox's reporting on polls today before he goes on their show. I mean, this is a wacky political day, I got to tell you. But look, I mean, there's a lot that could come from this. It's going to be hard to imagine that Donald Trump doesn't dominate Republican eyeballs, one, because he's on Fox, and two, he's Donald Trump. So I don't know how many Republicans in Iowa are going to be watching CNN. They don't typically anyway. And so what impact will the debate between Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis have tonight? We'll wait and see, but it could actually have an impact on who comes in second. And that could have an impact on more momentum potentially for Nikki Haley if she can pull that off. So imagine the lead up to the week of New Hampshire. I know we've got a caucus coming up, but think about New Hampshire a week from now. And that, you've got this Chris Christie announcement that's going to help her. And if she does well in Iowa, that could help her. I mean, that's a lot of momentum going into New Hampshire where she already has some momentum.
So, Rick, just from a strategy point of view for her campaign going forward, if you have an opportunity to consolidate the anti-Trump vote, because Chris Christie was the most vocal anti-Trumper of the group, and Ron DeSantis and Vivek Ramaswamy are seen as much more akin to the former president, is it time to really lean into that, potentially come out harder against Trump than she has to this point?
Nope. In fact, I would not change her style on the campaign approach at all. Like her previous job at the UN, she is the United Nations of this campaign. She is a little something for everyone. The Never Trumpers like her. The Trumpers like her as an alternative. The soft GOP like her. The mainstream likes her. So her magic right now is that she is the vessel for anybody who doesn't want to be Trump. And that's, as we know from polling, that could be as much as 70% of this primary field. So the last thing she wants to do is get defined by anybody like Chris Christie just because he leaves the race. Welcome to the UN Part 2.
Fascinating. Well, we'll be watching as usual, so you don't have to on another split screen night. Rick, great to have you back. Rick Davis, partner at Stonecourt Capital, who will be with us in Iowa and New Hampshire, along with Jeannie Shanzano. Coming up, we'll be joined by our political panel today as we count down to the Iowa caucuses and the first in the nation primary. On Balance of Power, this is Bloomberg TV.
If your state chooses Trump on Monday, would you support the ex-president?
I'm a Republican. Any one of the candidates that we have running will do a better job than the absentee president that we have serving at this point. It is unbelievable what we see happening under this administration. And so without hesitation.
Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds in an interview for Bloomberg News' Big Take DC podcast, which is premiering tomorrow with host Saleha Mosin. Joining us now, our political panel to dig into this, Sarah Chamberlain, Republican Main Street Partnership President and CEO, along with Kristen Hawn of Rock Solutions. Great to have you both here. We've had a rambunctious day in the world of politics.
And it's not over yet.
Yeah, it's not at all, Sarah. So what's going to happen next? Because we just saw Chris Christie drop out of the race, and there was a lot of question about whether it will, in fact, make a difference and create the momentum that Nikki Haley needs, presuming you think the votes go there.
I think they do, and I think it's the only chance Nikki Haley has of trying to win New Hampshire. So I was happy to see Chris Christie do that. I like Chris Christie very much personally, but it was time.
Did they have you call him? We're trying to figure out who got to Chris Christie.
Maybe. No.
Okay.
No, I did not.
Kristen, does Joe Biden have more worry perhaps this evening than he did just a few hours ago before this news dropped?
I don't think so. I think that the president and his team are, concerned about all of the candidates, including the former president. So,
but Nikki Haley is a more frightening proposition than the former president.
She could be, but there's not. Maybe not. We're looking at some of the polls, showing in Michigan, showing President Trump up by double digits. So I'm not saying I give all the credence to every single poll that comes out, but I think that, every situation is serious.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of polls, the ones we're seeing in New Hampshire are a bit noisy, but one this week that we saw from UNH and CNN showed Nikki Haley within single digits, realizing Suffolk University, a competing poll, showed a much wider spread. I wonder where you think the game really is here, though. It's so difficult to tell in an early state where independents could crowd the polls. What's your take, Sarah?
If she's going to have a victory, it's going to be in New Hampshire. And I really think Chris Christie dropping out helps her. I think the Chris Christie people will go to her, and then she's very competitive with Trump. So it's really going to be interesting to watch. If she's successful in New Hampshire, I would not be surprised if she rolls into South Carolina and has a very good night.
So game on here. It's going to be a very fascinating next couple weeks.
Yeah, are we talking about a real contest here when we haven't been for so long? Obviously, all of this is in presidential politics, but Sarah, we also have to talk about the politics here in Washington right now because the House is back. The government could shut down in 10 days. Is that going to happen, or is Mike Johnson going to have to pass a short-term CR, which he promised not to do, and risk his gavel?
He is going to pass a short-term CR. I don't question that at all. He has to.
He wouldn't answer the question today.
No, but he has to. I mean, we can't shut down the government. The members of the Republican Main Street Partnership, which you just had one of mine on bill, nobody wants government shutdown. It does not benefit anyone. So you have to do a short-term CR.
Okay. That would suggest maybe attention paid to a few other items. We were talking daily, hourly about a deal on the border until things apparently went on ice a couple of days ago, negotiators not sounding quite as optimistic. And there's more where that came from here as we consider the job that Congress has in the new year. If we avoid a shutdown, can we talk again about things like Ukraine, Israel, the border?
I think all those things are on the table. And that's kind of what happens when you have these vehicles, where things are moving and you've got these big issues and you have members, particularly in the Senate, you mentioned immigration, who are willing to work together. Those, it seems cool 1 hour, and then you get an update in the next hour, and it's hot again. And, the coverage of it is always just a little bit behind of what's happening behind closed doors. So I would expect to see all of those things you mentioned on the table going forward if there's a CR.
Well, we know the president spoke directly with House Speaker Mike Johnson today. But, Sarah, we just keep returning to the question as he's navigating what conservatives want on the border, what they maybe don't want on Ukraine, what they want to keep the government open. That's a very hard job to do with a very tight margin. Are we still going to be calling him Speaker Johnson by the time these battles are done?
Okay, I have to tell you, I certainly hope so. He has the hardest job in Washington. It's proven when they voted Kevin out, there was no plan. There's a small group of Republicans that really would rather vote with the Democrats. They brought a rule down today on the floor. They vote as Democrats. Hopefully, they will keep him in. There is no plan if they do oust him. And we need a Speaker of the House. I mean, this is absurd what is happening here. So he has to get a small CR, short-term CR, and move forward, and he has to stay as Speaker, or all chaos will break loose.
The new chair of the Freedom Caucus showed up at the Republican leadership meeting last evening. Bob Good, again, don't fear the shutdown is the line. Could we see a weekend, a couple of days here, that might satisfy the rank and file before something else comes together?
Our men and women will be satisfied with a short-term CR.
Yeah.
But I don't know how you satisfy, that small group of individuals.
Maybe you never can.
Maybe.
Yeah. On that note, we will leave it. Sarah Chamberlain and Kristen Hawn, thank you both so much for joining us this evening. What a day. And you can get more coverage of it and all the days like it to come by checking out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
What'll happen tomorrow? We'll meet you there on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.